Am I pure evil? Am I the face of terror sitting here in front of you? Or am I able to talk to you man to man?
In this video, we will explore some of the most notorious men who were executed on death row in the United States. We will look into their heinous crimes, their last words, and the final meals they requested before facing their fate. Make sure you are subscribed to the channel to never miss a video, and let's get into it. Ted Bundy. State, Florida. Between 1974 and 1978, Ted Bundy kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and murdered at least 30 young women and girls across 7 states, though the actual number may be much higher. Bundy was known for his good looks and charm, which he used to gain his victims' trust. He would often approach women in public places, pretending to be injured by wearing a fake cast or sling, or posing as an authority figure before attacking them. In some cases, he would break into residences at night and bludgeon his victims while they slept. One of his common tactics was to pretend he needed help carrying books or loading something into his car, often a Volkswagen Beetle. Once he had lured women to his vehicle, he would attack them, sometimes handcuffing them before driving to a secluded location where he would sexually assault and murder them. After escaping from custody twice, once from an Aspen courthouse during a recess in his preliminary hearing, and again from the Garfield County Jail in Colorado, his killing spree finally came to an end on February 15, 1978, when he was arrested in Florida for driving a stolen vehicle. Just days before his arrest, he had broken into the Chi Omega sorority house at Florida State University, attacking 4 women and killing 2 of them in a frenzied attack. Then, a few weeks later, he kidnapped and murdered 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. While on death row, Bundy finally began confessing to some of his crimes in the hope of delaying his execution. He became something of a celebrity prisoner, giving interviews to psychologists and journalists about his crimes.
And listening to that horrible tape of him saying that he had followed my sister from the auditorium or whatever it was, and that is the first time I had ever felt anger and hate.
On January 24th, 1989, Bundy was executed in Florida's electric chair. For his last meal, he declined a special request and was given the standard last meal: steak, eggs, hash browns, toast, milk, coffee, juice, butter, and jelly. His final words were, "I'd like you to give my love to my family and friends." John Wayne Gacy, State, Illinois. Known as the Killer Clown, John Wayne Gacy sexually assaulted and murdered at least 33 young men and boys between 1972 and 1978 in Chicago, Illinois. Gacy was a respected community figure who volunteered at local hospitals and political organizations. He also performed as Pogo, or Patch the Clown, at children's parties and charity events. This friendly, community-oriented facade helped him avoid suspicion for years while he committed his horrific crimes. What made Gacy's case particularly disturbing was the double life he led. On the surface, he was a successful businessman who ran his own construction company, PDM Contractors. He was active in local politics and was even photographed with First Lady Rosalynn Carter at a Democratic Party event in 1978. Behind this respectable image, Gacy would lure young men and teenage boys to his home with promises of construction work, money, or alcohol. Once there, he would drug them with chloroform or alcohol, handcuff them under the pretense of showing a magic trick, then torture and eventually strangle them with a rope or garrote. He buried 26 of his victims in the crawlspace beneath his house, while others were disposed of in nearby Des Plaines River when the crawlspace became too full. Gacy would sometimes perform sexual acts with the corpses before burial, and later reported that this was when he felt his ultimate thrill. After years of suspicion and investigation, police finally arrested Gayy in December 1978. The investigation began when 15-year-old Robert Peast went missing after telling his mother he was going to talk to a contractor about a job. This contractor was Gayy. During a surveillance operation, police noticed a strange smell coming from beneath Gacy's house. During a search, they discovered the remains of his victims. Gacy's trial began on February 6, 1980. He attempted an insanity plea, claiming that an alternate personality had committed the murders, but the jury didn't buy it. He was found guilty of 33 counts of murder and sentenced to death. On May 10, 1994, after 14 years on death row and multiple appeals, Gayy was executed by lethal injection at Stateville Correctional Center. For his last meal, he requested a dozen fried shrimp, a bucket of KFC original recipe chicken, French fries, and a pound of strawberries. His infamous final words were simply, "Kiss my ass, Timothy McVey." State, federal. On April 19, 1995, Timothy McVey carried out the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. He detonated a truck bomb outside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people, including 19 children in the building's daycare center, and injuring more than 680 others. McVey, a Gulf War veteran with strong anti-government views, had carefully planned the attack as revenge for the federal government's siege of the Branch Davidian compound in Waco, Texas, which had occurred exactly 2 years earlier. The bomb itself was massive. A rental truck packed with approximately 5,000 pounds of ammonium nitrate and nitromethane, a potent homemade explosive mixture. The blast was so powerful that it destroyed 324 buildings within a 16-block radius, shattered glass in 258 nearby buildings, and burned 86 cars. The estimated cost of the damage was $652 million. Just 90 minutes after the bombing, McVey was stopped by Oklahoma Highway Patrol Officer Charlie Hanger on Interstate 35 for driving without a license plate. He was arrested when the officer discovered he was carrying an unlicensed Glock 21 pistol. For the next few days, McVey was held on firearms charges, but investigators soon connected him to the bombing through a vehicle identification number from an axle of the destroyed Ryder truck found at the scene. His accomplice, Terry Nichols, turned himself in when he heard McVey was in custody. Another associate, Michael Fortier, testified against McVey in exchange for a reduced sentence. In 1997, McVey was convicted of 11 federal offenses, including use of a weapon of mass destruction, 8 counts of first-degree murder of federal officers, and conspiracy. He was sentenced to death on all counts. On June 11, 2001, McVey was executed by lethal injection at the Federal Correctional Complex in Terre Haute, Indiana. For his last meal, he requested 2 pints of mint chocolate chip ice cream. He didn't make a verbal statement, but instead handed out copies of the poem Invictus by William Ernest Henley, which ends with the lines, "I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul." Gary Gilmore. State, Utah. Gary Gilmore gained notoriety not only for his crimes, but for being the first person executed in the United States after the Supreme Court reinstated the death penalty in 1976. Born in Texas in 1940, Gilmore had a troubled childhood marked by physical abuse from his alcoholic father. By age 14, he was already involved in criminal activity, and he spent much of his youth and early adulthood in and out of juvenile detention and prison for various crimes including assault and armed robbery. On July 19, 1976, after being released from prison after serving 12 years for armed robbery, Gilmore robbed and murdered Max Jensen, a gas station employee in Orem, Utah. The next evening, he robbed and murdered Benny Bushnell, a motel manager in Provo. In both cases, even though the victims had complied with his demands and handed over money, Gilmore shot them point blank in the head, leaving no witnesses. Gilmore was arrested shortly after the second murder when his cousin's wife, Brenda Nicole, turned him into police after she became suspicious of his behavior and a bloodstain on his pants. Physical evidence, including the murder weapon and shell casings that matched those found at the crime scenes, quickly linked him to both killings. What made Gilmore's case remarkable was his insistence, after being sentenced to death, that his execution should proceed without delay. He actively fought against appeals filed on his behalf and even attempted suicide twice while on death row. His famous quote, "They always want to get in on the act," was in response to the numerous legal challenges filed by third parties trying to stop his execution. Gilmore's case became a nationwide sensation, inspiring books and movies. On January 17, 1977, Gilmore was executed by firing squad at Utah State Prison. His last meal consisted of a hamburger, hard-boiled eggs, a baked potato, and a few cups of coffee. His famous last words, which have since entered popular culture, were simply, "Let's do it." These words later inspired the Nike slogan, "Just do it," according to advertising executive Dan Whedon. Clarence Ray Allen. State, California. Clarence Ray Allen ordered the murders of 3 people while already serving a life sentence for another killing. That alone made him one of the rare individuals in American history to receive the death penalty for crimes he orchestrated from behind bars. His path to death row began in 1974, when, at the age of 44, he planned the burglary of Fran's Market in Fresno, California. Allen ran a security company and had previously installed the store's alarm system, so he knew the layout well. He arranged for his son Roger to invite Brian Schleitwitz, the son of the store's owners, to a pool party at Allen's house. While Brian was swimming, his keys to the store were stolen. Later that night, Allen and his accomplices used those keys to break in and steal about $500 in cash and over $10,000 in money orders. Afterward, Roger's 17-year-old girlfriend, Mary Sue Kitts, helped cash some of the stolen money orders. But when she later confided in Brian about the burglary, Allen decided she had to be eliminated. He first tried to have her poisoned with cyanide, but that failed. Eventually, he ordered an accomplice, Eugene Furrow, to strangle her. After the murder, her body was dumped in the Friant Kern Canal and never found. However, in 1977, Allen was convicted of first-degree murder and sent to Folsom State Prison with a life sentence, based largely on Furrow's confession and the testimony of others involved. While in prison, Allen was enraged that several people, including Brian Schleitwitz, had testified against him. So, he came up with a plan for revenge. He convinced a fellow inmate, Billy Ray Hamilton, who was about to be released on parole, to kill the witnesses once he was released. Allen gave Hamilton a list of targets along with specific details about them. Once Hamilton was out, Allen's son Kenneth supplied him with weapons and transportation. On September 5, 1980, Hamilton walked into Fran's Market carrying a sawed-off shotgun. He shot Brian Schleitwitz in the head at close range. Then he killed 2 young employees, 17-year-old Josephine Rocha and 18-year-old Douglas White. A 4th person, Joe Rios, was shot as well but survived by pretending to be dead. But just a few days later, Hamilton was arrested for an unrelated robbery. When the police searched him, they found the shotgun in a hit list that matched the names and addresses of the witnesses from Allen's trial. In 1982, Allen was convicted of 3 more counts of first-degree murder, each with special circumstances, and this time he was sentenced to death. For the next 23 years, the case made its way through the appeals process. Allen's lawyers argued that executing him would be cruel and unusual punishment. By that point, he was 76 years old, blind, in a wheelchair, and had suffered a heart attack. But the appeals were rejected by the U.S. Supreme Court. On January 17, 2006, Clarence Ray Allen was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. He was the oldest person ever executed in California, and the second oldest in the country since the death penalty was reinstated in the 1970s. For his last meal, he asked for buffalo steak, fried chicken, Kentucky bourbon pecan pie, sugar-free pecan ice cream, and whole milk. His final statement included, "My last words will be, Hoka hey, it's a good day to die. Thank you very much. I love you all. Goodbye." Stanley Tuki Williams. State, California. Stanley Tuki Williams grew up in poverty in South Central Los Angeles. In 1971, at age 17, Williams and a young man named Raymond Washington founded what would become the Crips Gang. According to some accounts, the group began as a way to protect the neighborhood from rival gangs. But whatever the original intent, it didn't take long for the Crips to turn into a violent criminal organization. They got involved in everything from extortion and drug dealing to murder. The crimes that ultimately sent Williams to death row happened in early 1979 during 2 separate robberies. The first victim was Albert Owens, a 26-year-old employee working the night shift at a 7-Eleven. Williams and 3 accomplices walked in just after midnight, forced Owens into a back room, and made him lie face down on the floor. Then, Williams shot him twice in the back. They walked away with about $120. Less than 2 weeks later, Williams went after the Brookhaven Motel on Vermont Avenue. This time, 3 people lost their lives. Motel owners Yanni Yang and Tsai-She Yang, who were both in their 60s, and their daughter, Yi-Chen Lin, who was visiting from Taiwan. Each of them was shot at close range with a shotgun. The total take from that robbery was reported to be just around $100. Williams was arrested not long after and charged with all 4 murders. At trial, the prosecution leaned heavily on the testimony of accomplices and jailhouse informants. Several of them claimed Williams had openly bragged about the killings, even describing how the victims had begged for their lives. But while he sat on death row at San Quentin, Williams began to renounce gang life. He started writing a series of books for kids, warning them about the dangers of gangs and violence. He also developed something called the Tuki Protocol for Peace, which was designed to help rival gangs broker truces. Because of those efforts, Williams received multiple Nobel Peace Prize nominations. Despite many calls for clemency, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger ultimately denied his request. The governor said that Williams' positive contributions did not outweigh the brutality of the murders or his refusal to take responsibility for them. On December 13, 2005, Stanley Tuki Williams was executed by lethal injection at San Quentin State Prison. For his last meal, he declined a special request and had oatmeal with milk and fruit. In his final statement, Williams said, "The state of California is about to execute an innocent man." He also left a message for young people, saying, "To all the youth in California who haven't been exposed to my advocacy against gangs and gang violence and indoctrination, I say to them, as I've repeatedly said, that I want to apologize to you all for allowing myself to be used to further create this monster of gangs and gang violence." Ronny Lee Gardner. State, Utah. Ronny Lee Gardner is probably best known for being the last person in the United States to be executed by firing squad. He was born in 1961 in Salt Lake City, and his childhood was rough from the start. He grew up surrounded by neglect and abuse, and he got into drugs and alcohol at a really young age. By the time he was just 10 years old, he was sniffing glue and using hard drugs. At 11, he was sent to a mental hospital. And by 16, after a string of run-ins with the law, he became a ward of the state. Gardner's adult criminal record started early too. At 18, he was convicted of robbery. Then, in 1984, while serving time for that robbery, he killed a bartender named Melvin Otterstrom during another robbery. But the crime that would eventually lead to his execution happened not long after that, on April 2, 1985. That day, Gardner was being escorted to a court hearing on the Otterstrom case at the Metropolitan Hall of Justice in Salt Lake City. Somehow, his girlfriend, Karma Hainsworth, managed to smuggle a .22 caliber handgun into the courthouse and slipped it to him. In a desperate attempt to escape, Gardner opened fire. He ended up shooting and killing an attorney named Michael Burdell, who just happened to be there representing another client. Burdell tried to hide behind a door, but Gardner shot him in the face at point-blank range. He also shot and wounded a court bailiff named Nick Kirk. Gardner himself was shot in the shoulder during the chaos and was caught before he could get away. One tragic irony in all of this is that Michael Burdell, the attorney Gardner killed, was reportedly against capital punishment. Friends later said he never would have wanted his killer to be executed. Later that year, in October 1985, Gardner was convicted of capital murder for Burdell's death and sentenced to die. He chose the firing squad, saying, "I lived by the gun, I'll die by the gun." But in the 25 years he spent on death row, Gardner claimed he had changed. He said he found redemption and even talked about wanting to create an organic farm program for troubled youth. He called it Back to Basics, and believed that maybe, if something like that had existed when he was young, his life would have turned out differently. There were also last-minute appeals to the U.S. Supreme Court and a clemency hearing before the Utah Board of Pardons and Parole. But in the end, none of it worked. Gardner's execution went ahead as planned. For his last meal, Gardner asked for steak, lobster tail, apple pie, vanilla ice cream, and a 7UP. On June 18, 2010, he was executed at the Utah State Prison in Draper. The execution chamber had to be specially modified. A metal chair was bolted to the floor and surrounded by sandbags, meant to catch any bullets that bounced. A paper target was pinned over his heart. He was strapped into the chair, and a hood was placed over his head. 5 volunteer marksmen stood behind a wall with rifle ports. One of their rifles was loaded with a blank, so no one would know for sure who fired the fatal shot. His last words were, "I do not fear what comes. When it comes, it comes." Juan Raul Garza. State, federal. Juan Raul Garza was a drug trafficker who ran a massive marijuana operation from Mexico into the U.S. during the early 90s. To protect his business, he ordered the murders of 3 men he believed were informants: Thomas Rumbo, Gilberto Matos, and Erasmo de la Fuente. Each was shot in the head at close range. In August 1993, Garza was convicted in Texas of multiple charges, including 3 counts of murder tied to his drug enterprise. He was sentenced to death. Then, on June 19, 2001, he was executed by lethal injection at the federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana, just 8 days after Timothy McVey. Garza was only the second federal inmate to be executed since 1963. For his last meal, he asked for steak, fries, onion rings, a diet cola, and 3 slices of bread. In his final words, he said, "I just want to say that I'm sorry, and I apologize for all the pain and grief that I've caused. I ask for your forgiveness. God bless." Clayton Lockett, State, Oklahoma. Clayton Lockett was convicted of the 1999 murder of 19-year-old Stephanie Naiman, along with charges of sexual assault, kidnapping, robbery, and forcible sodomy. At the time, he was 23 and already had a felony record. The crime happened in Perry, Oklahoma. Neiman had seen Lockett and 2 accomplices, Sean Mathis and Alfonso Lockett, break into a home to collect a drug debt. They forced her to drive to a remote area. When she refused to give up her truck keys and promised not to go to the police, Lockett shot her twice with a sawed-off shotgun. She was buried alive in a shallow grave. An autopsy later confirmed she had been breathing when she was buried. Lockett was sentenced to death in 2000. Mathis received life in prison, and Alfonso got 25 years. On April 29, 2014, Lockett's execution took place at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary. The team had trouble finding a vein and eventually placed the IV in his groin. The first drug, a sedative, was given at 6:23 p.m. He was declared unconscious 10 minutes later, and the next 2 drugs were administered. But minutes after that, Lockett began moving, groaning, and trying to speak. Officials closed the blinds and halted the execution. He died of a heart attack at 7:06 p.m., 43 minutes after it began. The botched execution led to national criticism and a temporary pause on executions in Oklahoma. An investigation found that the IV had come loose, causing the drugs to be absorbed into tissue instead of the bloodstream. The case also prompted a federal review of the death penalty process. For his last meal, Lockett requested steak, shrimp, a baked potato, garlic toast, pecan pie, and ice cream. But when told the meal exceeded the $15 limit, he declined and was given the standard prison meal instead. Because of the complications, he wasn't able to give a final statement, although he had spoken with his attorneys and a spiritual advisor earlier that day.